The world ended in a flash of green. No one saw it coming, not the governments, not the military, not the scientists tracking distant stars. 1 minute, Ethan Granger was sipping cold beer on his porch, and the next, the sky was smeared with swirling emerald clouds. The air seemed to hum, vibrating like a tuning fork shoved deep into the Earth's crust. Then the ships arrived, massive, monolithic war machines, their hulls rippling with metallic scales that reflected the sickly green light above. Cities fell within hours. Tanks turned to molten slag, fighter jets crumpled in midair as if clenched by an invisible fist, and entire battalions simply vanished beneath scorching beams that carved deep scars into the land. Ethan wasn't a hero. He wasn't a soldier anymore, either. That part of his life had ended 2 years ago, when a failed mission had left his best friend bleeding out in his arms. Ethan had walked away from that world, trading gunfire for cold beer and isolation in a cabin deep in the woods. But when he heard the screams on the emergency radio, and saw those ships drifting silently overhead like steel vultures, something old and ugly stirred inside him. The war wasn't over, it had just come to his doorstep. The Vraxians were nothing like the movies. They didn't lumber around in clunky suits or drag their claws across metal. They were sharp, precise, and terrifyingly organized. Their soldiers moved like living shadows, tall, armored figures with glowing crimson visors and weapons that hummed like angry hornets. Their leader, Overlord Crax, broadcast a chilling message across every screen on Earth. Humanity's resistance would be crushed. Any attempt to fight back would be met with overwhelming destruction. The message was punctuated by a chilling demonstration, half of Chicago reduced to black and rubble in less than a minute. Ethan knew better than to grab a rifle and charge into battle. He wasn't a fool. Instead, he watched, he learned, and he waited. The Vraxians relied heavily on their technology. Their armor could deflect bullets, and their war beasts tore through steel like paper. But they were arrogant. They believed humans were weak, predictable. That was their first mistake. The second mistake was underestimating just how insane one pissed-off ex-soldier could be. Ethan didn't join the resistance right away. He stumbled upon them when they tried to hijack a Vraxian supply convoy and failed miserably. The Vraxians surrounded the resistance fighters in the shadow of a collapsed overpass, cutting off all escape routes. Ethan had no intention of getting involved, until one of the resistance members, a young girl no older than 16, stumbled right into his hiding spot, her arm bleeding badly. She looked at him, terrified and hopeless. Ethan didn't think. He acted. Moments later, Vraxian soldiers charged in to finish off the resistance squad, only to find their path blocked by an old pickup truck, its cab stuffed with propane tanks and tied to a makeshift detonator. Ethan's grin stretched wide as he fired the trigger from behind a dumpster. The explosion shook the ground, and by the time the Vraxians scrambled to regroup, Ethan had slipped through the smoke, dragging the wounded girl with him. The resistance wasn't sure what to make of him at first. Sergeant Maria Vega didn't trust him, said he was reckless, arrogant, and exactly the kind of person that got others killed. But Ethan didn't care about trust. He cared about results. Over the next few weeks, he proved himself. Where the resistance played it safe, Ethan went for chaos. He sabotaged Vraxian outposts using makeshift traps built from car batteries and duct tape. He set fire to supply caches using stolen flares and barrels of motor oil. He jammed their communications by wiring an old radio tower to blast distorted recordings of opera music across their signal bands. Each time, he left some twisted calling card behind, graffiti of a skull with a cowboy hat, scrawled in spray paint. The Vraxians had no idea what to make of him. But Overlord Crax wasn't laughing. Word spread that the alien commander was furious, obsessed with hunting down the human behind the attacks. Crax had crushed empires across the galaxy, annihilated civilizations that had dared to resist. The idea that one stubborn human could humiliate him was unthinkable. Crax's obsession turned Ethan into a ghost, a legend whispered among resistance fighters. The man who hijacked a Vraxian walker using nothing but jumper cables and a microwave oven. The lunatic who tricked an elite patrol squad into chasing him through an abandoned carnival. only to get them all stuck on a rusted Ferris wheel rigged with tripwires. The stories were exaggerated, but the victories were real. And Ethan knew that meant trouble. The turning point came when the Resistance received a message. A captured Earth soldier named Colonel Sanders was being held at a fortified outpost. Rescuing him seemed impossible, but Sanders held crucial information about the Vraxian command network. Maria wanted to play it safe, retreat, and regroup. Ethan had other ideas. 2 nights later, Ethan crept through the Vraxian perimeter disguised as one of their own. The suit barely fit, and the helmet's visor flickered like a bad TV, but it was enough to slip past the guards. Inside, Ethan found Sanders, tied, gagged, and half-conscious. But something felt wrong. Too easy. Too quiet. That's when Sanders whispered, "It's a trap." The Vraxians swarmed in moments later, crimson visors glowing like devil eyes. Ethan fought his way out, dragging Sanders with him, but the aliens closed in fast. They forced the Resistance squad into an abandoned shopping mall, trapping them between broken escalators and shattered storefronts. "We're dead," one fighter muttered. Ethan disagreed. He ripped open a Vraxian drone's control panel, crossed a few wires, and grinned. Seconds later, the mall's speakers erupted with deafening pop music, the cheesiest bubblegum pop anthem Ethan could find. The Vraxians panicked, their visor systems scrambled by the sudden noise. While they flailed, Ethan and his team escaped through a shattered window. That night, Ethan sat by the fire, ignoring Maria's lecture about his recklessness. He couldn't explain it, but he felt something shift, like the Vraxians weren't as invincible as everyone believed. He had spent years thinking he was done being a soldier. But now, as he watched the flames dance, Ethan knew better. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. The Vraxians were frustrated, and that made them dangerous. After weeks of successful sabotage and humiliating setbacks, their commander, Overlord Crax, had reached his breaking point. Entire sectors of their occupation zone were now labeled Phantom Territory, a reference to Ethan's elusive presence. Crax's forces had grown paranoid, doubling patrols and launching random sweeps through the ruined cities. Civilians were dragged from their homes, interrogated, and punished for merely looking suspicious. Ethan's victories had come at a cost, and now the Vraxians were determined to make Earth bleed. Ethan knew his luck wouldn't last forever. Each skirmish made him a bigger target, and Crax wasn't just a brute, he was learning. The aliens had started planting false supply caches, loaded with tracking beacons instead of real supplies. Resistance squads would break in, grab the loot, and unwittingly lead Vraxian squads straight back to their hideouts. Ethan had barely evaded one such trap, forced to dive out a third-story window just as a Vraxian sniper took his shot. He hit the pavement hard, bruised but alive, and spent the night holed up in a storm drain while search teams crawled the streets above. The Resistance's hideouts weren't much better. Ethan had moved between 6 different shelters in 2 weeks, dodging Vraxian patrols and drone scans. Maria's patience was wearing thin, and Ethan knew why. Each time the Vraxians caught a whisper of his presence, they retaliated with brutal force. Innocent people were caught in the crossfire, and Maria couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan's tactics were putting too many lives at risk. Ethan didn't disagree, but he knew the alternative, playing it safe, was a guaranteed way to lose. The Vraxians were too strong, too entrenched. Guerrilla warfare was the only card humanity had left, and if that meant fighting dirty, Ethan was willing to get his hands bloody. The trick was to stay unpredictable. That's how the booby trap idea started. It began as a joke, a ridiculous suggestion to rig an old Vraxian walker with a car horn and a bucket of honey. The idea spiraled from there. Ethan's team scrounged every odd item they could find: nails, fishing wire, gasoline, batteries, and spray paint. They turned junkyards into trap factories. Ethan rigged everything from pressure cooker bombs to tripwires and alleyways. One trap involved nothing but marbles scattered down a staircase, simple, yet remarkably effective when paired with a panicked squad of heavily armored soldiers. The Vraxians didn't know what hit them. One patrol stumbled into a car lot wired with makeshift explosives hidden in hubcaps. Another squad found themselves trapped inside a warehouse when Ethan's team used power tools to seal the doors, then flooded the room with smoke grenades. One particularly absurd victory involved Ethan baiting a Vraxian elite squad into a construction site where he'd coated every surface in cooking oil. The towering soldiers slipped and skidded like drunken ice skaters until backup arrived to haul them away. Crax's anger became legendary. Reports from captured soldiers spoke of violent outbursts, control panels smashed in fury, subordinates publicly humiliated for minor mistakes. Crax demanded results. The Vraxians knew what was at stake. Their technology was unmatched, but their resources weren't infinite. If Earth's resistance dragged the war out long enough, the Vraxian Empire would eventually decide this invasion wasn't worth the cost. Ethan knew his best chance of winning was to turn Crax's ego into his greatest weakness. That plan nearly fell apart when they rescued Colonel Sanders. The old soldier was tough, but he wasn't the man he used to be. Weeks in Vraxian captivity had broken something in him, and his mind wasn't as sharp as it once was. He flinched at sudden noises, stammered through conversations, and sometimes forgot where he was. Ethan pitied the man, right up until Sanders betrayed them. It wasn't his fault. The Vraxians had implanted a mind control node in the back of Sanders' skull, a slim, metallic spike that pulsed beneath his skin. None of the resistance fighters knew until it was too late. Sanders had spent weeks feeding their location back to Crax, unaware that he was doing it. When the attack came, it was overwhelming. The Vraxians struck at night. The Resistance's safehouse, once a half-collapsed theater, turned into a war zone. Explosions ripped through the walls, and crimson beams sliced through the dark like lightning. Ethan sprinted through the chaos, dodging falling debris and guiding fighters to the emergency tunnels. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of burning plastic. He heard Maria barking orders somewhere behind him, her voice hoarse and ragged. The Vraxians poured in through shattered windows and smashed doors, their energy rifles crackling with deadly precision. The resistance barely escaped. Ethan's group stumbled into an abandoned shopping mall several blocks away, panting and bloodied. The remaining fighters looked hopeless, terrified. They knew the Vraxians would be on their heels soon, scanning the streets and hunting them down. Ethan knew they wouldn't win a straight fight. He grabbed a Vraxian drone, one he'd snatched during the earlier chaos, and began rewiring its internal speakers. Maria thought he'd lost his mind. The others thought he was stalling. But when the first wave of Vraxian soldiers stormed the mall, Ethan flipped the switch. The mall's ancient PA system roared to life, blasting deafening pop music across the entire building. The Vraxians staggered, clutching their helmets as garbled noise flooded their communications. Some of them stumbled and fired blindly, others froze, unable to coordinate through the sonic chaos. Ethan and the others fought like cornered animals, using the confusion to slip away down maintenance corridors and shattered skylights. Later that night, as the survivors regrouped in a dimly lit basement, Maria confronted Ethan. She was furious that he'd risked everything on a stunt, furious that people had died, furious that no matter how clever Ethan's tricks were, the Vraxians were still winning. Ethan didn't argue. He just sat quietly, nursing a swollen wrist and listening to Maria vent. She was right. The resistance couldn't keep running. Crax was tightening the noose, and no amount of booby traps or stolen drones could stop him forever. They needed something bigger, something that could break Crax's grip entirely. That's when Ethan remembered the power nodes. Vraxian elites carried them, sleek, glowing devices that powered their personal energy shields. The Vraxians relied on those shields like crutches, believing themselves invincible behind their shimmering barriers. If the Resistance could steal one and reverse engineer it, they might be able to disrupt the shields altogether. It was insane. It was suicidal. And Ethan knew it was their only shot. The plan to steal a power node wasn't just insane, it was borderline impossible. The Vraxian elites who carried them were no ordinary soldiers. They were towering brutes clad in reinforced exoarmor, each one equipped with a personal energy shield that rendered bullets and shrapnel useless. Worse still, these elite squads operated in tightly organized teams, never straying far from their command posts. Getting close enough to snatch a node was like trying to steal a crown jewel from a vault guarded by dragons. But that didn't stop Ethan from trying. The first step was finding a target. The Vraxians were methodical in their patrols, which meant patterns, and patterns could be exploited. Ethan spent days observing their routes from the shadows, tracking their movements from a crumbling apartment complex that overlooked a Vraxian checkpoint. The elites always moved in pairs, never stopping for more than a few minutes. Each time they passed the checkpoint, their power nodes flickered briefly, a momentary reset that exposed a tiny sliver of vulnerability. That's when Ethan knew he had a chance. Ethan's plan relied on two things: speed and misdirection. The team gathered every smoke grenade, flashbang, and noisemaker they could scavenge. Maria argued it wasn't enough. She was right, but Ethan knew they couldn't afford to wait for better odds. The longer they delayed, the stronger Crax's grip tightened. They had to act. The night of the heist, Ethan positioned himself inside an old janitor's closet near the checkpoint. The space smelled like mold and stale mopped water, but it gave him the perfect vantage point. Maria's team staged a fake ambush 2 blocks away, detonating a stolen Vraxian mine to draw the elite's attention. The distraction worked. The 2 armored giants lumbered away from the checkpoint, weapons crackling as they charged toward the chaos. Ethan slipped out of the closet and hurried to the checkpoint console. The power node lay cradled in a protective casing, glowing faintly beneath a transparent shell. The casing had no locks, only a smooth metallic surface with strange symbols carved across it. Ethan wiped his sweaty palms on his shirt and pressed his fingers against the casing, hoping for luck. Nothing happened. He swore under his breath, examining the console. The symbols shifted, rearranging themselves in looping patterns. His fingers hovered over the interface, searching for something that resembled a keypad. In desperation, he tapped random sequences, hoping instinct might guide him. The casing hissed, and the power node released with a satisfying click. Ethan grabbed it and bolted. The Vraxians realized the trick moments later. Alarms blared across the checkpoint, red lights flashing as Ethan sprinted down the alleyway. The 2 elites came crashing back, their shields humming to life as they stormed through the narrow streets. Blaster fire scorched the walls beside him, and the air stank of melted concrete and ozone. Ethan ducked into a mechanic's garage, weaving through rusted cars and piles of scrap metal. He could hear the thundering footsteps of the elites closing in behind him. Ethan's escape relied on a final, desperate gamble. He slid beneath a rusted pickup truck and hurled a detonator switch over his shoulder. The second it clicked, the truck's fuel tank erupted, sending shrapnel and flames through the garage. The blast wasn't enough to kill the elites, but it staggered them, giving Ethan the few precious seconds he needed to slip away. Back at the Resistance hideout, Ethan handed the stolen power node to Maria, his face still smudged with soot. The tech team immediately went to work, dismantling the device like vultures stripping a carcass. Hours stretched into days as the engineers struggled to understand the alien technology. The node's core was a pulsing blue orb, surrounded by delicate circuits that seemed to react to even the slightest vibration. Any mistake could destroy the entire device, and possibly the Resistance fighters working on it. Eventually, one of the engineers, a wiry man named Travis, discovered a breakthrough. The node emitted a signal that stabilized the Vraxian energy shields. By reversing the signal's frequency, they could potentially disrupt the shields instead. If it worked, the Vraxians' most powerful defense would become their greatest weakness. The Resistance's next attack had to count. With Crax growing increasingly desperate to find Ethan, patrols had doubled across every major city. The Vraxians weren't taking chances anymore. They had begun bombing entire blocks to ensure no human resistance could take root. Families were fleeing their homes, entire districts reduced to rubble and ash. The air stank of burning plastic and scorched metal, and the streets were littered with bodies. Each day felt heavier than the last, and morale among the Resistance was starting to fracture. Ethan proposed a bold strike, an ambush on Crax's primary command post. The Vraxians had fortified their base inside an old stadium, ringed by automated turrets and drone patrols. If the resistance could disable the shields and breach the outer defenses, they had a shot at crippling the Vraxian command structure. The ambush began just before dawn. Ethan led a strike team through a drainage tunnel that connected to the stadium's lower levels. The power node jammer, wired together with scavenged radio equipment, pulsed faintly in Travis's hands as they crept through the tunnel. Once inside, they planted explosives beneath the support columns, rigging the arena's structure to collapse if things went wrong. The jammer's signal activated just as the Resistance's second team launched an assault from the stadium's entrance. Blaster fire erupted in the distance as Ethan's team emerged from the tunnel, weaving through smoke and debris. The Vraxian elites, confident in their shields, charged headfirst into the fight. The first elite reached Ethan, raising its crackling blade with mechanical precision. Ethan fired his rifle, expecting the shot to bounce harmlessly off the shimmering shield, but instead, the bullet punched clean through the armor, dropping the alien like a sack of stones. The disruption worked. Vraxian soldiers scrambled for cover, their armor now nothing more than heavy metal plating. The Resistance fighters swarmed in, rifles blazing as the Vraxians' advantage crumbled. The battle was brutal. Ethan dodged debris and falling bodies as the stadium's walls began to fracture from the explosives they'd planted earlier. He fought his way toward the command tower, hoping to finish the job by sabotaging Crax's communication relay. Crax was waiting for him. The alien commander stood atop a raised platform, a massive war hammer crackling with energy clutched in his hand. His crimson visor glowed like fire, and his voice rumbled through the air. "You think you've won," Crax growled. "But I know your face now. I know your name." Ethan barely dodged the first swing as Crax's hammer smashed into the wall behind him, sending chunks of concrete flying. He fired wildly, but Crax's armor deflected the shots. The hammer swung again, forcing Ethan to dive behind a console. His fingers scrambled across the control panel, and with a desperate slam of his fist, Ethan triggered the explosives beneath the stadium. The blast rippled through the structure, collapsing entire sections of the building. Ethan staggered toward the exit, smoke choking his lungs. He didn't see Crax rise from the rubble, battered but still alive. The aftermath of the stadium battle hung heavy over the Resistance like a storm cloud. The victory had been real. They had crippled Crax's command post, scattered his forces, and stolen valuable intel, but the mood was anything but triumphant. The data they recovered painted a grim picture. Crax wasn't retreating. He was preparing for something far worse. Ethan stood in the Resistance war room, staring at the grainy projection of a Vraxian schematic. The image flickered, but the outline was unmistakable, a massive cylindrical device with jagged black spires protruding from its core. Travis, the tech expert, explained it with a grim expression. The Vraxians called it a gravity bomb. Once activated, it would release a shockwave that would compress everything within a 50-mile radius into a dense, obliterated heap. Buildings, vehicles, people, nothing would survive. The worst part wasn't the bomb itself. It was the fact that Crax had installed it directly in the heart of a densely packed district, a former city center now filled with refugees and Resistance hideouts. The bomb's countdown had already started. They had less than 24 hours. Maria gathered the surviving fighters and laid out their options. None of them were good. Assaulting the bomb site directly would be suicidal. The place was surrounded by Vraxian sentries, war drones, and automated turrets. Even if they fought through, the bomb was wired to detonate if tampered with. Travis believed that a Vraxian command node could override the detonation sequence, but those nodes were rare, only carried by high-ranking officers or elite guards. The only confirmed node lay in Crax's personal command post. Ethan knew what that meant. Crax was daring them to come for it. He had survived the stadium collapse, and now he was waiting, hungry for revenge. Ethan volunteered to lead the mission. Maria resisted at first, but there was no point arguing. They both knew Ethan was the only one stubborn enough to pull it off. The infiltration began at dusk. Ethan's team slipped through the ruins, weaving through collapsed buildings and shattered streets. The air smelled of rust and smoke, and the distant hum of Raxian patrol drones never stopped. The closer they crept to Crax's compound, the tighter Ethan's chest became. He knew Crax would be expecting him. The entire operation felt like walking into a noose. They reached the outskirts of the command post, a twisted tower of metal and glowing blue veins that pulsed like a heartbeat. Drones circled above, and sentries patrolled the perimeter in tight formations. Travis Jammer had worked for the previous strike, but Ethan knew Crax wouldn't fall for the same trick twice. They had to do this the hard way. Ethan slipped into the shadow of a collapsed truck and watched the patrol patterns. Every 30 minutes, a gap appeared, barely enough time for a small group to slip through. Ethan and Maria moved first, ducking behind debris and creeping toward the base. The others followed in pairs, blending with the dark. As Ethan reached the outer wall, he spotted a narrow maintenance tunnel. It wasn't part of the standard patrol path, the perfect weak point. The tunnel stank of stagnant water and rotting metal, but they moved quickly. The deeper they went, the stronger the vibrations beneath their feet became, a constant, rhythmic thrum that pulsed through the walls. The gravity bomb was already building energy. The tunnel opened into a control chamber, a vast room filled with glowing Vraxian consoles and cables that stretched like tangled vines. At the far end stood the command node, a sleek black sphere encased in a protective shell. And standing beside it was Crax. Crax's armor gleamed in the low light, its red accents glowing faintly. His crimson visor locked onto Ethan immediately. The warlord's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "I knew you would come," Crax growled. "You should have stayed hidden. Now you die with the rest of your kind." Crax moved with terrifying speed, his hammer roaring to life with crackling energy. Ethan barely dodged the first swing, the weapon smashing into the floor with a concussive blast that sent metal shards flying. Maria opened fire, her bullets sparking harmlessly against Crax's armor. The warlord turned and hurled a metal console toward her. She dived clear just in time. Ethan grabbed a crowbar from the wreckage and lunged at Crax's back, slamming the metal bar into the alien's armor. It barely scratched the surface, but it was enough to get Crax's attention. The warlord spun and lashed out, striking Ethan hard enough to send him skidding across the floor. Pain shot through Ethan's ribs, but he forced himself up. The fight spiraled into chaos. Maria darted between consoles, firing bursts of gunfire while Ethan kept Crax's focus. Crax's strikes were brutal, and each swing of his hammer shook the floor. Sparks rained down from the ceiling, and control panels burst from the strain. The countdown timer on the gravity bomb's display screen showed less than 10 minutes remaining. Ethan's ribs screamed in pain as he pulled himself behind a toppled console. Blood dripped from a gash above his brow, blurring his vision. Maria fired another shot, aiming for Crax's exposed back, but the warlord's shield flickered to life again. The earlier disruption tech wasn't working anymore. Crax had adapted. Ethan knew there was only one way out. He reached into his jacket pocket and found the detonator switch he'd been carrying, the one wired to the explosives his team had planted beneath the control room floor. It was supposed to be a last resort, something to use if they failed. Ethan stared at it, knowing what it meant. He met Maria's eyes. She knew too. "Go," Ethan muttered. "Get the others clear." Maria's face twisted with protest, but she knew better than to argue. She grabbed the command node, clutching it tightly to her chest, and disappeared into the tunnel. Crax loomed above Ethan, his hammer raised high. The warlord's voice rumbled with smug satisfaction. "You cannot win," Crax sneered. "You are nothing." Ethan smiled, blood running down his chin. "Yeah," he rasped. "But I'm about to ruin your whole day." He clicked the detonator. The explosion roared like thunder, ripping through the floor in a wave of fire and smoke. The blast hurled Ethan and Crax into the air, crashing them both through tangled wires and shattered machinery. The ceiling buckled, steel beams crumpling like tin foil. Ethan barely registered the impact, just the deafening roar of the collapsing tower. When Ethan opened his eyes, the night sky greeted him. His body ached everywhere, and the world spun in dizzying circles. He tried to stand, but his limbs refused to obey. Figures moved in the haze, resistance fighters dragging Maria and the others to safety. Ethan closed his eyes again, certain that this was the end. Days later, Ethan woke up in a makeshift medical tent. His ribs were bound tight, and his face was wrapped in gauze. Maria sat beside him, arms crossed and eyes red from exhaustion. When she saw him stir, her face twisted in relief and rage. "You stupid idiot," she said, voice breaking. "I thought you were dead." "Yeah," Ethan muttered weakly. "Me too." Maria smirked, then punched him lightly on the arm, hard enough to sting. "You're buying me a drink when this is over," she said. Ethan grinned through the pain. "Deal." The days following the explosion felt surreal. The Resistance had won a major victory. The gravity bomb was destroyed, Crax's command post lay in smoldering ruins, and the Vraxians were scrambling to recover. For the first time since the invasion began, hope flickered among the survivors. People smiled again, even if just a little. Streets that had once been deserted saw clusters of civilians stepping out of the shadows, exchanging food and stories as though life might actually have a chance to return to something resembling normal. But Ethan couldn't relax. He knew better. Crax wasn't dead. He had barely survived the explosion himself, and that meant Crax, armored like a walking tank, could have made it too. Maria tried to convince him otherwise. She believed Crax had been buried beneath the rubble, too wounded to escape. But Ethan knew. Crax wasn't the kind of enemy that disappeared without leaving a trail. He spent restless nights sitting by the fire, cleaning his rifle or sharpening his knife just to keep his hands busy. The ache in his ribs still flared up when he moved too fast, but the pain was easier to ignore than the nagging feeling that Crax was out there, waiting for his moment. The answer came sooner than expected. A Resistance scout stumbled into their hideout one evening, half dead from exhaustion and covered in burns. Between gasps, he told them about a Vraxian warship preparing for launch just outside the city. Crax was aboard, and he wasn't planning to leave quietly. The scout claimed the ship's energy core was unstable, rigged to detonate if the launch was interrupted. If Crax couldn't conquer Earth, he was determined to reduce as much of it as possible to ash on his way out. Ethan felt cold rage tighten in his chest. Crax wasn't just retreating, he was planning to take the entire city with him. Thousands of refugees had poured into the ruins seeking shelter. They wouldn't have time to evacuate. The Resistance had to stop that ship. The plan came together quickly, but it was barely a plan at all. The warship was too large to bring down with explosives alone, and any direct attack would set off the unstable core. The only option was to infiltrate the ship and disable the core manually before it could overload. Ethan volunteered without hesitation. Maria didn't bother trying to talk him out of it this time. She just handed him a battered pistol and muttered, "Don't be an idiot." The infiltration was chaos from the start. The ship was surrounded by heavy Vraxian patrols, more soldiers than they had ever faced before. The Resistance fighters launched a full-scale diversion attack to buy Ethan time, drawing the Vraxians away from the main hangar. Blaster fire lit up the night sky as explosions rippled across the battlefield. The air stank of scorched metal and burning concrete. Ethan's team slipped through a side maintenance hatch while the fighting raged outside. Inside the ship, the air was cold and sterile. The walls were sleek black metal, pulsing faintly with streams of glowing blue veins, the ship's power network. The deeper they moved, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, like they were crawling inside something alive. The energy core chamber was located near the heart of the ship, and that's where Ethan knew Crax would be waiting. They reached the core room without resistance. The room was massive, dominated by a spiraling pillar of crackling blue energy contained within a glass cylinder. Pulses of light danced along the cables feeding into it, growing faster and brighter with every second. The core was already destabilizing. Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for his tools, prying open the control panel. Lines of alien symbols scrolled across the screen. He didn't understand them, but Travis had taught him which sequence controlled the failsafe. Before he could start, a low growl filled the room. Crax emerged from the shadows like a nightmare given form. His armor was dented and scorched from the earlier battle, but he moved with the same terrible precision as always. The crimson visor fixed on Ethan, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Crax activated his hammer. "You should have run when you had the chance," Crax rumbled. Ethan drew his pistol and fired. The bullets sparked harmlessly off Crax's chest as the warlord advanced. Ethan dove sideways just as the hammer slammed into the floor, leaving a molten crater where he had stood moments earlier. Sparks showered the room, and the ship's energy core flared dangerously bright. Every strike shook the ship, each blow driving the unstable reactor closer to overload. Crax lunged again, his hammer swinging in a vicious arc. Ethan ducked under the swing and scrambled toward the console. The symbols flickered wildly now, and Ethan had no time to think, only to guess. His fingers danced across the panel, activating the shutdown sequence Travis had shown him. For a breathless second, nothing happened. Then the energy core's glow dimmed slightly, its pulse slowing. Crax roared in fury. He charged, and this time Ethan had nowhere to run. The hammer caught him in the side, lifting him off his feet and slamming him against the wall. His vision blurred, and for a terrifying moment, all he could hear was the dull throb of his own heartbeat. But then he saw it, a thick, braided power cable running from Crax's armor to the ship's core. The warlord's strength wasn't just from his armor, he was feeding directly off the ship's power source. Ethan reached for his knife. His ribs screamed in agony as he pushed himself upright. Crax advanced again, raising his hammer for the killing blow. Ethan lunged, plunging the blade deep into the power cable. Sparks erupted in a violent burst, and Crax's armor flickered and sputtered. The warlord staggered back, his hammer suddenly dull and lifeless. His crimson visor dimmed, and his breath hitched with something that almost sounded like fear. "You!" Crax rasped. Ethan grabbed a fallen piece of metal debris, a jagged scrap of twisted steel, and drove it into the exposed power socket on Crax's chest. The warlord convulsed, sparks crackling from his armor as his systems failed. His massive frame collapsed to the floor, motionless. The ship's alarm blared, warning of a critical meltdown. Ethan stumbled back to the control panel and finished the shutdown sequence. The energy core flickered, sputtered, and finally dimmed to a faint glow. The countdown stopped at 23 seconds. Ethan barely remembered escaping the ship. He staggered down the ramp, smoke curling from his clothes, and stumbled into Maria's waiting arms. The remaining resistance fighters were battered and bloodied, but alive. The warship's engine sputtered and died as Crax's twisted command collapsed. For the first time in months, the sky didn't glow green. In the days that followed, news spread quickly: the Vraxians were retreating. Without Crax's leadership and the destruction of their warship's core, their forces collapsed in disarray. Some fled off-world, while others were hunted down by human resistance fighters, finally gaining the upper hand. Earth was still scarred, its cities battered and broken, but for the first time since the invasion began, humanity had hope. Ethan sat by a campfire outside their new shelter, a worn flask in one hand. Maria dropped into the seat beside him, exhaling slowly. "You know," she muttered, "if you keep pulling insane stunts like that, people are going to start thinking you're some kind of hero."